As the nuclear talks between Iran and the United States face new delays, tensions are escalating amid a sharp shift in Washington's tone. President Trump has publicly declared that only a total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program will be acceptable, and raising questions about the viability of any agreement. Inside the U.S. administration, divisions have surfaced between officials pushing for military action and others seeking a diplomatic solution. In Tehran, President Pezeshkian asserted that Iran's future will not be tied to talks with Washington. Are the negotiations facing a deadlock? What role does Israel play? And what future lies ahead for Iran's nuclear program? Welcome to In Depth. Axios has reported that the U.S. President Trump publicly stated for the first time that the goal of the U.S. negotiations with Iran is the full dismantlement of its nuclear program. His comments respond to calls from the Republican senators for clarity on Iran policy. While Trump expressed openness to Iran having a peaceful civilian nuclear program, he firmly ruled out the possibility of the nuclear weapons, citing global security concerns. Axios added that this declaration resolves a growing internal debate in the Trump administration. Hardliners advocate for military pressure to force dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, while others prefer a diplomatic compromise that allows limited enrichment to avoid war. Iran, however, has consistently rejected the idea of full dismantlement. Trump's position is expected to heavily impact the upcoming round of nuclear talks, according to Axios. Trump says the full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program is the main goal of the talks that have stalled in its fourth round.
U.S. President Donald Trump has declared that the goal of the ongoing nuclear negotiations with Iran is total dismantlement, the most explicit statement yet since talks began last month. Trump said Iran could pursue a peaceful program, but a nuclear weapon is non-negotiable. This statement comes as the fourth round of talks in Rome was abruptly postponed. While the U.S. cited logistical reasons, Iranian officials pointed to Washington's contradictory behavior, especially following the announcement of new sanctions on entities linked to Iran's oil trade. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, divisions are deepening inside the Trump administration. Reportedly, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and recently dismissed National Security Advisor Mike Waltz favored a military option. However, Waltz's removal exposed a broader conflict, sparked by his secret contacts with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israeli media and U.S. sources suggest Netanyahu pushed for a strike on Iran, prompting concerns over Israeli influence of American policy. In Tehran, President Masoud Pezeshkian insisted Iran would not tie its fate to the talks. He said that if the talks become complicated, Iran's future is not dependent on Washington. As diplomacy stalls and pressure mounts, the prospect of a negotiated deal remains uncertain.
And for more analysis, we're joined from Cairo by Mohammed Izzeddin, El Ahram managing editor, and from Paris, Mr. Meher Nicholas Ferdsley, international affairs researcher. Welcome, gentlemen, for joining me today at In Depth. Let's start off with Mr. Izzeddin. The Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, stated that Iran will not tie its future to negotiations with the U.S. How should we interpret this as a strategic message?
Thanks for having me. Iran stated as just an introduction by Iran, and the Iranian attempt on the head of its its references, that to have an unlimited, determined, and not to rely on the American demands. And of course, we know that it's behind it only Israel. And Iran thinks that is trying to get again in a return of abandon the production of a nuclear bomb with the continuation of a peaceful program of the nuclear energy, and not to move forward in producing the ballistic missiles and its relation to the enrichment of uranium. Such a statement aims to determine more the Iranian stance in the course of negotiations in the upcoming period. This does not mean to submit its will to the Iran or the American demands, or to provide some sort of concessions that against its interests in order to avoid the economic sanctions or the most worsen scenario, which is the strike by Israel or by the United States.
Mr. Ferdsley, President Trump has now publicly set total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program as his red line. What does this shift mean for the future of the talks, do you think?
I think we're witnessing a game of shadows, or a tournament of shadows, by which I mean it's typical of Cold Wars, when you have, big, gigantic global wars. And in the 19th century, it was the race between Russia and England. Today, it's the new Cold War pitting China against Trump's America. When you have that situation, many things happen behind the surface. So the situation is very complex and shadowy. To make a long story short, in my opinion, what we saw, what we saw recently with the ousting of Michael Waltz is a reflection of these shadows brewing under the surface. I think in reality, Trump himself and J.D. Vance, so the core of the Trump White House, they are realists and even ultra-realists. So they're very cynical about Iran, and they're very cynical about the world. They look at the world in a very quote-unquote rational Machiavellian manner. They have not many preconceived ideas about, good and bad, black or white. They're very pragmatic, radical pragmatists. And they don't necessarily want to go the aggressive way towards Iran. That is the reality of Trump. Now, verbally, when he speaks to the media, when they speak to the media, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are very careful. So officially, their stance on Iran is a tough stance. So officially, they say there's no way we would accept blah, 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 any hint or shade or form, even microscopically, of nuclear plants in Iran with any dual-use civilian military potential. That's the official line.
Okay.
In reality, I think that they're willing to negotiate with Iran pragmatically. And if Iran sticks to a purely civilian use of its nuclear plant with an enhanced international, presence to double check, some supervision from the international nuclear energy experts, being allowed free access to all the nuclear facilities, etc. I think if the Iranian regime accepts all that, I think the White House would be happy to strike a deal, quote unquote, with Iran, because they think that Iran is fairly important. They think it's a pivot nation. It's a second level or middle-sized power, but it plays a pivotal role from a geostrategic perspective. Remember, in that great China versus America war.
Mr. Ferdsley, let's move to our other guest, Mr. Izzeddin. And reports, sir, reveal that the Israeli interference in the U.S. policymaking towards Iran led to the dismissal of the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. How do you interpret this, sir?
Absolutely. The matter is very clear. The U.S. administration is very keen. Its main ally in the Middle East, which is Israel. Yet there are several parties within the U.S. administration do not wish but for the U.S. resolution to be on the head and not to, or rather to avoid any involvement of U.S. into open wars or any matters that would damage the American budget. Most importantly, the military elements, particularly the Sixth Fleet and the Navy, in addition to the other matter which I consider is a conflict between the new U.S. administration wings. I do not say that due to the lack of expertise with respect to the U.S. administration, but there is some sort of a balance that President Trump wishes to achieve in order to avoid the damages of the U.S. interest in the Gulf specifically. As we know, if military attacks against Iran would lead to a retaliation, could be into Israel, that would develop in the worst scenario into the American bases in the Gulf, and that will create a great shock to the strategy of energy. Trump's calculations, and I specifically, are most economically. The president never wishes to kill the chicken that produces golds. I mean, its interest in the Middle East and the Gulf area. So the dismissal of Waltz as a national security consultant is a clear message that the ultimate decision is solely in the hands of U.S. and not Israel. So, of course, this good resolution with respect to the matter and do not ignite matters either in the Middle East or with respect to the U.S. administration inside. And I think that there are several changes in the personnel of U.S. administration in the upcoming period with the escalation differences between the wings inside the U.S. administration.
Let's go back to Mr. Ferdsley. The U.S., sir, has imposed new sanctions on companies linked to Iranian oil trade. How do you think do such measures affect the negotiation process? And in your opinion, do you think it's the reason why the talks stalled, or are there any other reasons you might think of?
So once again, I think it's only on the surface. So on the surface, as a negotiation tactics, Trump is playing tough on Iran, not because he wants to hurt them or strike them, because he wants them to make middle-of-the-road concessions. And I think Trump is eager to sign a deal with them. That's why he's putting pressure on them commercially, using, oil, equipment, sanctions. In reality, he wants to sit with them. He doesn't want to change the regime. He thinks that if they are smart, the Iranian mullahs will come to the table and negotiate and make concessions. Why am I saying so? For a very simple reason, once again, we have come full circle. So the world has come full circle. Benjamin Netanyahu, he has a hardline stance on Iran.
Yes.
He wants regime change. He wants America to strike Iran. And that was the position of some people in Washington, like, Mike Waltz. And the fact that Mike Waltz was forced to resign, the fact that he was pushed out, says a lot about Trump's thinking. Okay. His thinking is not hardline. Why have we come full circle? Because Netanyahu himself started his career.
But then, sorry, sir, to cut you, but then why do you think would be the reason why are the talks actually stalled? They've been postponed, the fourth round.
Because it takes time, because it's not easy. These are very difficult, very complicated talks, and they won't come easy. So if and when the Iranians make a few concessions, they will have to make them gradually and slowly. Even internally, inside Iran, there is a face-saving problem because they've been telling their own, population that America is the great evil or the great Satan or whatever, and that Trump is bad. So even internally, to market, to sell the idea of making a compromise with Trump, it will take time, no doubt. We've come full circle because, once again, Netanyahu himself started his career in Washington at the Israeli embassy in Washington at the time of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and he was a protege of Moshe Arens. And Moshe Arens was the all-powerful Israeli ambassador to the US in 81, 82. Why am I saying so? There was another crisis in the White House in 81, 82. The equivalent of Mike Waltz back then was Alexander Haig. Alexander Haig was accused by Reagan and by the other members of the Reagan cabinet of having a secret relationship and making direct contact with the Israeli government behind the back of the American president. That's exactly what Mike Waltz was accused of 10 days ago.
So in that sense, you think it's a full circle?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, let's go to Mr. Izzeddin then. Sir, indirect US-Iran nuclear talks in Oman were described as being constructive, yet the fourth round was postponed. And do you think we're witnessing a pause in diplomacy or a deeper deadlock resulting from contradictory positions, maybe, within the US administration?
Let me speak firstly about the negotiation. I do not think that there was no delay of the fourth round of negotiation, but with respect to the negotiation and them itself, but that Trump's determinations of 60 days only, that he wished to close this file, mainly, we do not forget that the deal made in Obama's era that include 7 parties, not only Iran and US, sponsored by Oman. I think it is a kind of approachment between negotiated parties. Therefore, I think the outcomes that the US wishes for, or an attempt in laying down main principle of full dismantling of the Iranian program, and also talking about the ballistic missiles and producing the raw fuel, and also talking about the enrichment of specific degrees. If this there is an approval of the peaceful program by the international supervision, these are the American wishes. Iran also, firstly, want to show itself that they not wish to produce nuclear bomb, and also not to affect the strategic weapons such as the ballistic missiles, along with the enrichment uranium, and to return to the international community through the lifting of the international economic sanctions that largely damage Iran. As we know, there are direct threats by the US president and the successive administration not to cooperate economically or to buy the Iranian oil. This matter pressures strongly within Iran, and I think that the course of negotiation and its agreement goes through not to produce nuclear bomb only.
Sir,
not to
I'm going back to I'm going back to the Iranian oil, to Mr. Ferdsley. Sir, Trump warned of secondary sanctions on anyone buying Iranian oil. How could this affect the relations between the U.S. and the key global players like China? And do you think, is it going to push them closer maybe to Iran or not? What do you think?
It's a very good question. So once again, what matters in the eyes of the Trump White House is the techno-geo-economic rivalry with Beijing, not Iran, not Israel, not Europe. Yeah. And so, of course, they're careful not to push Iran completely towards China. So they don't want, to hurt Iran's interest that much that Iran will have no other choice but to embrace China fully. So they want to keep a balance, but they are putting pressure. You're right. They're putting pressure on the Iranian regime, but there's a bigger, I think there's a bigger way, stronger way of putting pressure on the Iranian regime. So basically, banning or sanctioning Chinese importers of Iranian oil is not very efficient. There's much better for America is to let the price of oil go down. And that's exactly what the White House has done, with some help from Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, with some help by general economic circumstances. The price of oil, the barrel of oil, lost 50% in the past 6 months. So the barrel of Brent today is at $62, $63 per barrel of oil. That is hurting Iran much, much more than sanctioning Chinese importers of Persian oil.
Mr. Izzeddin, back to you again, sir. Trump said he is open to a peaceful nuclear program for Iran. How does Iran view this, do you think?
I think such a statement is a positive statement by the US President, and such a statement could be the reason to scale up the negotiation or the resumption of the fourth round between Iranian American negotiations sponsored by Oman. I think it is also comes in the framework of the policy of stick and carrot. That is a policy President Trump follows either through the direct executive orders or his statement before or even after he took office in the White House. And I think such a statement is designated as a positive step, and with respect to the Iranian officials would receive this positively, provided not to have some sort of a pressure against Iran by talking about the Libyan experiment by closing the nuclear program in 2003, or talking to attach the other military industrial programs with respect to the ballistic missiles. And I think the President's statement is positive and smart. That would help the continuation of negotiation, but still cannot actually provide a direct positive outcomes.
Mr. Ferdsley, we're back to you again, sir. The dismissal of Mike Waltz came after reports of coordination with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu regarding military action against Iran. How do you think could this affect the U.S.-Israeli relations, do you think?
I think it's a classic. It's a great classic of Israeli-American theater, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is a great player of that theater, and he was trained once again in the early 1980s at the Israeli embassy in Washington by Moshe Arens, and Netanyahu is a dual American-Israeli citizen, just like his mentor Moshe Arens. So he understands the nuance, the very fine nuances of the infighting inside the factions of the White House. After the ousting of Mike Waltz 10 days ago, what was left, the small leftover of the neocon, the neoconservative faction, is very diminished. So now we have, unlike the first Trump White House 4 years ago, which was half neocon, half realist. Today, in 2025, after the ousting of Mike Waltz, the White House is fully ultra-realist. No more neocons. So it's really America first. Yes, they have some degree of empathy, of sympathy for Israel, for the Israeli people, but that's it. It's no more than that. If there is a clash, or if there is a contradiction, or if there is a competition between Israeli interests and American national interests, because they are called ultra-realists, the Trump White House will always choose America's interests. It was less true with neoconservative politicians like Mike Waltz or Dick Cheney or George W. Bush.
Unfortunately, Mr. Ferdsley, we're running out of time, and that was Maher Nicholas Ferdsley, International Affairs Researcher, and Mohammed Izzeddin, El Ahram Managing Editor. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today and for your insights. And that concludes today's episode of In Depth. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Q News.